So if you want to follow along, there's a URL here that will lead to the slides. So there is some code and a link to the GitHub page for that code. So if you'd like to follow along. While you guys are typing in that URL, I want to tell you my MountainWest JS story that happened this morning. I mentioned at dinner that I've never seen snow. I was born in Phoenix and raised in Austin. So I've never seen anything more than like sleet about that thick. Well, this morning, Ryan Florence was pinging me on Twitter. He's like, "Where are you sitting?" And all of a sudden, he shows up with a bag of snow about that big piece of snow. And so I got to like run it through my fingers, and it's definitely weird. But yeah, that's my MountainWest JS story, is I got to see my first bit of snow. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, so let me put this into presentation mode, and we'll get started. All right, close enough. So, you should be using Flight. And I know what you're going to say first is what is it? And don't worry about the text being unreadable. It's kind of unreadable for a reason. The first sentence of Flight.js's website says it's a framework, and that's usually where people stop listening to me. They kind of glaze over. And the reason for that is they're already a fan of some other framework, like React or Angular, or a lot of Ember fans I've noticed here at this conference. And I think, oh, what the heck just happened? Huh, all right. Let's try that again. All right, so heads up, these next few slides show my opinion, and you're gonna wanna argue with me, and that's fine, just not right now. Find me later, and I will gladly discuss things with you. I think a lot of frameworks are shoehorned into situations in which they are not meant to be used. I've noticed a lot of people using frameworks where maybe framework isn't exactly necessary, and I've even met some Flight fans who use Flight where it shouldn't be used. And I think this is indicative of a larger problem, and that's that we have a serious fanaticism problem with frameworks in JavaScript. We tend to be dedicated fans of one framework, and we think in terms of that framework. And I really don't think that's healthy. I think we shouldn't be asking, how can I use Ember for this? How can I use Angular? How can I use Flight for this? I think we should be asking, how does this tool make my JS better? And I've actually been asked several times since I got to this conference, how is Flight like this? How is Flight like that? I don't think that's the right question. I think it's how can Flight make my JS better? Which I'm going to talk about. So obviously, that statement, I'm going to get a lot of argument about that, and that's fine. I will gladly talk to you later this evening. I'll pick a place and stick there. And yeah, so now we've gotten that out of the way. Again, with the fading out of the slides, that's a new feature. So the definition of the word framework is an essential structure, like an essential set of tools, essential thing to a building or a structure. And I think a lot of frameworks today do more than that, which is awesome. Don't get me wrong, they do a lot of really cool things. But Flight is a framework in that sense of the word. It is a very small set of tools. It does not do a lot of magic for you. It's very unopinionated in most parts. It does not prescribe an MV star. It does not prescribe any form of technology back end or front end. It just has a jQuery dependency, really. That's the only opinion it has in terms of what tech you use. And it's remarkably lightweight. It's 5K gzipped. Again, it does require jQuery, but I don't think that's that outlandish of a requirement in today's web development world. Like I said, Flight's not overly prescriptive at all. It is not an MV star framework. It's not just for single-page apps. It's not just for hyper-interactive clients, whatever that means. It does play well with other libraries. I'll explain this super complicated, very much detailed plan to integrate Flight into your current code. And what it does give you is the ways to structure your code to write better JavaScript applications. And how you use it is more up to you. It's just kind of pointers to build better applications. So there are a few commandments of Flight. Components are entirely agnostic. What you do is you define what a component is and what it does. When you instantiate a component in Flight, you no longer have direct access to that component. You can no longer go grab it and do something with it. The only way to get a component to do something once you have defined it and instantiated it is for it to listen for events, and it can emit events. So we'll get into why that's actually a really good idea later. It does require you to use the DOM. I've heard a lot of DOM hating in the past 24 hours, and I actually like the use of the DOM. And this framework definitely leverages that well, and it definitely helps. Finally, test everything. This is more of an implicit commandment. Flight makes it so easy to test your code that there's really no excuse not to. We're also going to go into functional mix-ins as a way to structure your JavaScript. Flight is very heavy on mix-ins usage instead of inheritance. And so I'm going to go into what functional mix-ins are. So there are a couple other languages that use this construct, but I've mostly found it used in JavaScript because of the prototype system. And what functional mix-ins do is they apply functionality to an existing prototype. Angus Kroll said on a blog post that described what functional mix-ins are that they're a process and not an object. You call a mix-in on a prototype, and it augments that prototype. And I personally think functional mix-ins are the best thing to happen to JS since JS hint. But that, again, is an opinion. And a lot of people ask me, well, why not straight up inheritance? Well, the Gang of Four book actually does state that you should value object composition over classical inheritance. And so it actually kind of does go with existing literature. And the second bullet describes a question that I had a lot when we did use classical inheritance with JavaScript at some other places that I've worked. And that's, does a button inherit from a form element, or does it inherit from another button, or does it inherit from a class called green, which, why did we have a class called green? And a lot of inheritance chains get really messy really quick, especially if you delve into multiple inheritance, which can just get weird. And then I actually don't think JS is meant for inheritance. It's a prototype-based system, and I really think object composition is a better way to handle your JS code than inheritance. And Angus Kroll tends to think the same. So I'm going to go into how to write a Flight.js application. The Flight.js sample code that I put a link to in the slides, it's also available if you just go to Perch on GitHub, and then it's mountain_west is the repository. It was built using the Yeoman generator for Flight applications, so it gave me a lot of setup right off the bat, including a Karma testing setup, which is really nifty to have. So the first step for writing a component in Flight is to write your HTML. Basic general good practices apply. Use semantic HTML. Try not to get divitis. Try to class things semantically, or use IDs when necessary. This is the HTML that I wrote for a counter component, which actually I'll just show you the little demo right here. Close my dev tools. Just makes little counters. Nothing too terribly crazy. So this right here on the screen is all of the Flight-dependent JS that you'll need to write a component. There are a couple of unique pieces to this that we'll go into in more detail. The first is the this.defaultAttrs call, default attributes. This.afterInitialize is basically your constructor for your component. It's called after that component is attached to the DOM. And then your event handlers, your event listeners are right here. And then after this is just your own event handlers, which is your business logic, which is all the code that makes your app special. Like I said, the three components. So the this.defaultAttributes call, what you want to put in there is everything that makes your component unique. Like anything you need to access for that component would go in the default attributes, especially any HTML selectors or CSS selectors that you would want to call for that component. So any child elements that you'd want to access, any HTML values, data attributes that you'd want to access, you'll want to put those selectors in the default attributes class. And there's a reason for this that we'll go into in a little bit. The this.afterInitialize function callback is for your construction. This is for your setup of that individual component. This is the last time you'll be able to do things to that component, because it will then be only responding to events. And then event handlers and event listeners are going to be how your component interacts with your app. So to actually use a Flight component, you require in the definition, the code that was just shown, that's a component definition. You call it in, and you call attached to on a selector. And what it does is it creates an instance of that component for each instance of the selector that's on the page. So the reason we put all of our selectors in default attributes is because by doing this, when you call attach to, you can pass in new definitions for those selectors, and so you've then made your component HTML agnostic. You can use it with several different HTML setups. You just override those defaults, and that makes it kind of fantastic. If your markup changes, you don't have to change everything in your component. You just change one line that says, okay, this class needs to change. So I have to explain how the event bubbling works sometimes to newer devs and to devs that they're new to like the event-based structure. So I have a series of pictures that kind of explain how Flight handles events. So the first is all instances of a component are watching for the same events. And so in this case, the kittens are components. And on the toy falling, they all freak out and want to figure out where the toy is. This variable refers to the instance of the component. So when an event fires, it can access its children. It's still atomic because the component is only accessing itself. You're not accessing it from outside of there. And in this case, the gray cat is a component and reacts to its friend licking it. And in the last case, I've noticed recently, and we actually do this at Read Tell Me Not where I work, sometimes when an error event won't break the entire application, we'll actually throw an error event with a reference to the error object, and so we can react accordingly. If it's an Ajax error failing, we can tell it to retry, or we can tell the user, sorry, we can't do that right now. So I mentioned that testing was pretty easy with Flight. It's actually remarkably easy, especially for client-side JavaScript. A lot of people groan when they're told they need to test their client-side JavaScript because things are so rooted in the DOM, things are difficult to test, go try testing an Ajax call, etc. There's so many dependencies that make it hard to test. But because of the way Flight encourages you to structure your code, it's actually really easy to test Flight components. And the reasons are, components are tiny little services, that's all they are. They're tiny little atomic services. They're not accessed anywhere else. They're just constructed and then let out into the wild. And the other cool part about the event-based system is that now your component has a clearly defined API. If your component receives event A with data B, you know that it will emit event C with data D. You know what's going to happen, and that's 90% of what you need to test any code, is to know that when you get a certain input, you're going to get a certain output. There's more, actually. The Flight community has provided Flight Mocha and Flight Jasmine, which are wrappers around two of the most popular client-side JavaScript testing frameworks. And what they give you are the things that you will need the most, which are event spies and automated markup stubbing. So basically, you give it the markup you want for your component, and it will handle sticking it in the DOM and handling all the attachment for you. The Yeoman app generator for Flight is also remarkably useful. It sets up Karma for you and does all the configuration, which is fantastic. If you've ever done Karma configuration by hand, it can kind of be interesting. So it's nice that it sets it up for you. I don't have a timer, do I? I do not. Okay. So like I said, it gives you event spies, which are actually pretty robust. It will tell you how many times your event has been triggered. You can set it up to listen on a specific DOM point. So if you say, I want to know if this event was fired here, you can do that. You can access the data with which the event firing, basically when the event was fired, what data was sent with it. So I can say on the first call, if data.a equals foo, then hooray, the test passes. And it does give you headless test running via Karma, which is nice because when you're editing your code, it's nice to be able to just hit save and watch the test results run on the side. So this is the code for a Mocha Flight test. The setup component is the HTML stubbing out that I mentioned. You just give it a piece of HTML that you'd want to attach your component to, and it will handle injecting it into the DOM and handle all the cleanup there as well. And then in the actual test, we're setting up an event spy on document for the event counter change. And then you can click and manage handling the UI, actually interacting with the UI. And then, as you'll notice on the last few lines, expect events by to have been triggered on document, and expect events by is most recent call .data .to equal. It's in that very interesting dot syntax where it reads like a sentence, as Mocha does, and you want the value to be 1. So that's basically accounting for if you go to here, and you go to a counter that says 0, because that's how it's initialized, and you click there. That's testing that particular piece of functionality. Ooh, okay. I'm speaking a little faster than I thought I would. A lot faster. So, not only does Flight get, the tools are nice, but even without the tools, testing everything would be a commandment in Flight, because it encourages you to write code that is modular. It encourages you to write small components that have a consistent API, and that alone gives you most of what you need to test your client-side JavaScript, the fact that you have all of these components with consistent APIs. And that GIF is how I felt the first time I tested a Flight app. We actually used Flight in production at Retail Me Not, and I was the person who convinced us to use Flight, so I got to write some of the tests, and I was dreading it until I tried it. And then I felt like that, because it took me about 5 minutes to write the first test that actually tested something that it wasn't just, oh, does this component actually exist? It was, oh, if I click this, does this event fire here, and does that one fire over there? It was just very gratifying to be able to think, oh, I can handle TDD now with my client-side JavaScript. I'm not dreading writing tests anymore, because I can actually handle that quickly and efficiently. So you're probably still thinking at this point, but I still like Ember, Angular, whatever better. I don't want to use Flight. I want to use... That's the thing. I'm not trying to replace your favorite framework. Flight works extraordinarily well with other frameworks and other libraries because of the way it has you structure your code. But I also think there are times when Flight isn't the best solution. I try not to be a fanatic. I happen to like Flight, but I am very much a firm believer in using the right tool for the job. If there's a team that would code better in Ember, I would just code in Ember with them, because that's what would work for that team. Or if there's a project where a framework isn't really a good solution, I just wouldn't use a framework. And I'm kind of hoping to communicate that point that, well, it's good to like frameworks. It's really bad to singularly like one framework and not consider other viewpoints, or try to compare everything to your favorite framework. So I was talking with a friend last night, and I had this slide worded differently. He phrased it a lot better. Even if you are looking to move frameworks, even if you are interested in Flight, there's always a lot of concern with changing frameworks. It's always hard to move your framework, and there is never time to take down your entire application or to stop development on your entire application so you can move it to a new framework. That almost never happens. So I'm going to share with you the super complicated, super difficult, oh my God, help me plan to integrate Flight into your existing code. That's the entire plan. All you have to do, because of the way components exist, is add event listeners and event handlers in your own code and trigger events from your own code. Since you're probably already using jQuery, this is very easy to handle. jQuery delegates that out really well. So it's actually remarkably simple to integrate Flight with your existing code base, no matter how messy it is, no matter how crazy it is, no matter what frameworks you're already using. It's really simple to use. Flight really likes developers, I think, because it doesn't restrict us from using the other technologies that we want to use, and it doesn't prevent us from building our own applications. It doesn't kind of like fence us in, but what it does give us is the encouragement and the rules to create a sound structure from the beginning. Flight is more of a foundation in a sense. It doesn't give you a lot, but what it does give you helps you write better code. So one of the reasons is everyone's welcome in Flight Camp. Everyone is welcome. It's got an extremely low barrier to entry. If you already understand how JavaScript works, how async works, and how events work and bubble up the DOM, you've got 90% of what you need to write a Flight application. I found a lot of newer developers. I actually train JavaScript developers back in Austin for Girl Develop It. And I find that when they try to transition into the workforce, the scariest thing for them is they feel they're going to pick the wrong framework, and they're going to invest hundreds of hours in learning this huge system, and it's going to be the wrong one. With Flight, it takes about, I remember learning about Flight last year at JSConf, and I went back to my hotel room, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to try this. I kind of have my own little metric. I'm sure someone else thought of it first, but I call it the time to first hello world. I'll take a framework, I will sit there, I will read the documentation, and I will mark how long it took me to write a hello world. It took me 15 minutes to write a hello world in flight. It took me 20 minutes to write the counter application that you see up there in flight. So it's got a very low barrier of entry, and I think that's great if your team, especially if your team has a bunch of junior developers or a bunch of newer developers, or you just want to try something a little simpler. Like I said a couple times, I'm a fan of testing, and because you can test all the things easily, there's enough problems with being a web developer, servers going down, builds not working correctly. There's a million different things that can go wrong. It's really nice to say, I've got the tests around my client-side code. I can focus on all of the other chaos that happens. I can focus on that new feature that was dropped on my desk a day ago and they wanted it yesterday, sort of thing. Actually, oh yeah, I was actually trying not to run too much, too early, but it looks like I have, because that's one of my last slides. The most important thing I find about Flight is the people I have convinced to use it have become very happy with Flight and very happy with JavaScript. And developer happiness is extremely contagious, I've noticed. If your entire team is working on something that they believe in and something that they're not dreading to go to work to every morning, it spreads, and it spreads quickly, just like child's laughter. And that's what I've got. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, like I said, if you want to argue with me about frameworks, I'll probably be at Squatters or Red Rock or something like that. Come meet me and talk to me about frameworks. As long as the dialogue is constructive, I'm totally happy for it. And yeah. All right. Thank you.